Every parent I've known will tell you that their lives center around their young children as they are being raised. I realize there are exceptions, but most of us will do almost anything to make sure our children are well cared for, loved, and protected. We want to give them the very best upbringing we can possibly provide during their young lives. So when something goes tragically wrong, we as parents cycle through guilt, blame, so many questions, and terrible, awful, enduring grief. I couldn't help but empathize with Asia's parents while telling the heartbreaking story of what happened to their daughter. Come along with me for a ride through odd, strange, and mysterious here at Odd Mysteries Stories. Most parents probably tuck their kids into bed at night, feeling like they are perfectly safe. You expect to see their bright and shining faces the next morning. But not this Valentine's Day on February 14th in the year 2000. A 9-year-old girl would prove the fragility of this illusion by walking out of her home in the dead of night, never to return. Asha Degree, a missing child who would come to be known as Shelby's sweetheart, voluntarily left her home for unknown reasons and was never seen again. Asha lived on Oakcrest Street, just outside Shelby, North Carolina. Her household was happy, with a devoted mother named Ikea, a loving father named Harold, and an older brother called O'Brien. They were a devout family living in a one-story brick duplex with a nice-sized yard and a basketball hoop in their front driveway. They weren't necessarily well off, but they were certainly financially stable. Harold was a dock loader, and Ikea worked for Kauai America Manufacturing, where she built pianos. Asha and O'Brien were best friends as well as siblings, and they didn't seem to mind sharing a room with one another. Both took a strong interest in basketball and played for their school teams. Asha, in 4th grade, played for the Falston Elementary Bulldogs, and her brother, in 5th grade, played at the local middle school. She was highly competitive and considered a star player on her elementary team. Those who knew Asha described her as a cautious, intelligent, shy, soft-hearted, and cheerful child. She made friends with classmates nobody else would play with. She and her brother were latchkey kids, but only for a few hours in the afternoon after school. They'd usually work on homework until their parents arrived home from work. The FBI agreed that the Degree family home was loving, functional, and safe. Parents Harold and Ikea structured their children's lives around school, sports, family, and church, and worked hard to keep the kids protected from negative outside influences. Having heard horror stories about internet predators, Ikea even refused to put a computer in their home, and Asha certainly did not have a cell phone. These attentive parents never imagined sweet, obedient Asha would ever do anything to put herself in harm's way, but by every indication, that is what seems to have happened. Both Asha and O'Brien played basketball on Saturday, February 12th. Asha's game was first. She fouled out of the game and was unable to finish alongside her teammates. They lost by a single point. Asha was briefly inconsolable, crying so hard that it took both her family members and her teammates to calm her down. Of course, the incident was a small one, the kind of thing a child breaks down over only to shrug off later. Soon, she was smiling and happy again, cheering O'Brien on at his own game later that day. She slept over at a friend's house later that night. The following day, February 13th, Asha and her family attended services at Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church. They then spent the afternoon with Asha's grandmother and her aunt. Asha was acting normal. She seemed in good spirits, and there was no indication that she was planning anything new, strange, or different. At 6:30 p.m., Asha said she was tired from the sleepover and decided to take a nap. This might have been the first warning that something wasn't right, but her explanation was plausible enough. The girls probably stayed up later than usual, playing and giggling together. At 8:30 that night, Asha woke up and settled in to watch some television with her family. but she was back in bed within a half hour or so. Later that night, as temperatures plummeted and a cold rain began to fall, a vehicle struck a utility pole, knocking out the power across the neighborhood. The power was restored by 12:30 a.m. on February 14th, so the outage seems unrelated. Still, it sets the scene for the type of nasty weather that was happening in the area that night. At 2:30 a.m., Harold checked on the children and saw both Asia and O'Brien asleep in their bedroom. A bit later, he heard a bed squeak, but dismissed the sound as one of the children tossing in their sleep. It is perhaps at this time that Asia got out of bed and slipped out of the house for reasons unknown. At 5:45 a.m., IKEA decided to wake the kids up early so they could take a bath before going to school. It was then that she discovered Asia was gone and began to panic. She called Asia's grandmother and aunt who lived down the street. She then called her own mother. When Asia didn't turn up at the home of any family members, IKEA called 911, then took to the streets of her neighborhood, frantically calling her child's name. What would you do in this terrifying situation? The first officer arrived at 6:40 a.m. that morning. They found no sign of forced entry, and tracking dogs were unable to pick up a scent. This is unusual because search dogs are effective in almost any type of weather. Heavy rain can destroy all traces of a subject's tracks, but that doesn't necessarily prevent the dogs from finding the scent. In fact, they often track at their best in the early morning and during windy conditions. Police discovered that Asia's backpack and Tweety bird purse were missing, as well as several of her belongings, including a pair of her favorite blue jeans with a red stripe along the leg. Also gone were a long-sleeved white shirt with purple lettering, a red vest with black trim, and a long-sleeved black and white shirt. Along with her favorite basketball uniform, some family photos were missing too, as were some snacks from the house. It seems Asia took a house key as well, perhaps indicating she intended to return. Apparently, she locked the door behind her when she left. Law enforcement said they were the kinds of belongings that a 9-year-old might think to pack, rather than the types of belongings that an adult would have packed for themselves. As hundreds of volunteers were roused to hike through the local area in search of the girl, law enforcement concluded that she'd left the house voluntarily, of her own free will. The search ramped up quickly, involving horseback riders, the search dogs, emergency response teams, and a North Carolina Highway Patrol helicopter with infrared detection equipment. As tips and eyewitness accounts poured in, investigators were able to put some of the pieces together. At 4 a.m. that morning, a short-haul trucker named Jeff was driving a 10-wheeler northbound along Highway 18. He spotted a little girl matching Asia's description walking beside the road. Her head was down, and she wasn't wearing any winter gear, although the area was still covered in freezing rain. She was headed southbound toward Shelby and seemed to be alone. He observed that she seemed determined to get somewhere. Jeff became concerned and turned the truck around to check on her. Unfortunately, turning a 10-wheeler truck around on a highway in freezing rain isn't a quick endeavor. By the time he'd gotten himself pointed in the right direction and had returned to the location, Asia had disappeared into the woods. Unable to spot her among the trees, Jeff dismissed his suspicions and continued about his day, coming forward only when the story of the missing girl came out. The FBI vetted him and determined he was a credible witness. Other motorists would soon report that they, too, spotted a little girl meeting Asia's description walking southbound on Highway 18. Jeff and the others noted that Asia seemed to be walking at a good pace and was giving off the impression that she knew where she was going. Some of the other drivers assumed they were seeing a woman rather than a little girl. Eventually, the owner of Turner's upholstery shop would call in a tip. Though it took them some time to connect the dots, the Turners believed they had discovered some of Asia's belongings in an open shed on their property. Asia may have stopped to take shelter there, perhaps at a moment when the rain and fog became particularly unbearable. or maybe because the truck driver had accidentally spooked her. To get to this outbuilding, Asia would have had to walk 2 football fields uphill and cross a 3-foot deep gully. She might have seen a light outside the building, so perhaps she was hoping for a place where she could call for help. Instead, she found a storage shed without a door, filled with furniture and farm equipment. If she had been headed north, law enforcement might have speculated that she was heading toward her school, perhaps with some notion of practicing basketball in the wee hours of the morning, like many sports enthusiasts routinely do. But Falston Elementary is 4.8 miles north of Oakcrest Drive, a walk of an hour and 44 minutes for an adult in reasonably good shape. Asia could have gotten there by about 5:30 a.m. if that was her destination. But unless Asia misjudged the direction of a route she'd been driven along every day for years, her school doesn't seem likely to be her ultimate goal. 7 days after Asia went missing, on February 23rd, the county sheriff's office called volunteers off the search. They felt that, wherever she was, it was evident that she was no longer in the local area. At that time, there was no video surveillance in the neighborhood, and there were no traffic cameras along Highway 18. Thanks to the family's low-tech lifestyle, there was also no computer evidence left behind. The only traces of Asia at this point were the items she'd left in the shed. Candy wrappers suggest that she may have gotten hungry and consumed some or all of the food that she'd packed. She also left a pencil and marker and a Mickey Mouse hair bow, possibly dropped by accident. In the dark, she wouldn't have seen them spill from her backpack. It was 1 year later, in 2001, when a construction worker found Asia's backpack. It was black and beige with her name and number on it, so it was unmistakable. Terry Fleming was a construction worker digging an access road for a new home. Fleming found the backpack buried less than 50 yards off State Road 18. It was on the same route that Asia was traveling, but in the wrong direction. The bag was 26 miles north of where she'd been last seen. If she intended to go somewhere south of Shelby, perhaps someone picked her up and had other plans. The buried backpack was ominous. It was double-wrapped in black plastic bags, and it did not contain some of the items that the Degree family had reported missing from the home. Oddly enough, at least 2 new items had been added to the backpack. First, there was a New Kids on the Block t-shirt, and it did not belong to Asia. The second item was a Dr. Seuss book called McElligot's Pool. The book was checked out from the Falston Elementary Library where Asia attended. With a reading level of 3.6, it could have been a little below Asia's probable book reading level, so it might not have been one that Asia selected. However, some students read a grade lower if they find the book interesting. Unfortunately, the school didn't have a record of who checked out this particular book. Law enforcement has never released information about whether they were able to collect DNA samples from either the book or the shirt. Although there may have been other items in the bag, law enforcement withheld that information from the public. Media reports at the time say the book bag was found near the home of a convicted sex offender. Still, police didn't report finding any evidence linking that particular sex offender to Asia's disappearance. Law enforcement conducted a thorough search of the surrounding area, but found no further clues. In October of that year, someone found a black plastic trash bag similar to the one Asia's backpack had been wrapped in. The bag was sent to a police lab, but no results were reported that I could find. In 2004, acting on a tip from a man in prison, investigators conducted an excavation search at the corner of Shelby and Rube Spangler Road near Lawndale, South Carolina. They found only animal bones, though they did find a pair of men's khaki trousers. This dig site would have been only 6 miles from Asia's home. Again, if law enforcement was able to obtain any helpful DNA or other trace evidence from the trousers, they have not released that information. This was one of many inmate tips that law enforcement has received over the years, most of which did not pan out. Investigators note that inmates often have ulterior motives for offering such tips, such as obtaining privileges in prison that they wouldn't otherwise have access to. This means many prison tips are fabricated. Asia is not a typical runaway. Most children who run away are at least 12 years old and have problems at home, school, or both. She had no history of sleepwalking. The only potential incident that the FBI, the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office, and the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation point to that may have caused Asia to run away is that disappointing basketball game the Saturday before she left. But was that really enough to send Asia out into the rain and the cold? Asia's family has sadly endured accusations and wild speculations over the years. It seems the Degrees are a solid, God-fearing family, and I want to discourage my listeners from adding to their pain by offering more accusations in their direction. The truth is, Asia could have left for any number of reasons. Consider the psychology of an intelligent 9-year-old. While capable of some reasoning, planning, and navigation, a 9-year-old's prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain that helps us make good decisions, isn't yet fully developed at that age. While old enough to distinguish fantasy from reality, she wouldn't have been seasoned enough to separate truth from lies. In addition, she could have been influenced by any number of sources. For example, her fourth grade class was reading a book called The Whipping Boy by Sid Fleischman. It was a story of a prince and a commoner. The commoner receives lashes on the royal's behalf, and then the two boys run away together and have adventures, returning safely to their kingdom at the end of the story. Was Asia planning an adventure of her own? Was she supposed to meet a friend who never showed up? Did she think that she was somehow helping a friend in trouble by going out into the night, telling herself she had to be brave like the commoner boy? One of the items that was in Asia's backpack, another thing that was found in the shed, was eventually leaked to the public. It was a small photo of another young girl. The girl wasn't Asia, and the girl in the picture didn't attend Asia's school. Nobody seems to know who she was or what her connection to Asia might be. So did Asia have a notion that she could somehow help this girl by secretly leaving home that night? Maybe she thought she'd be back home before her parents woke up that morning. Or maybe an adult with ulterior motives was involved in luring Asia from her home. Speculations include someone promising to make her a big basketball star or to offer her extended coaching. February 14th was also her parents' anniversary. Did someone offer to help her set up a fun surprise for her parents? Or did someone slip her a note that scared or enticed her into leaving the house? At the age of 9, a child is old enough to know to wear a coat out into the cold. Perhaps the reason why she wasn't wearing any winter gear, and the reason why dogs couldn't get a trail, was because she never intended to walk down Highway 18. Perhaps she expected to be in a nice warm car all the way to her planned destination. Maybe someone picked her up right outside of her house. If that's the case, there's a chance Asia realized something was wrong relatively quickly and got scared. Perhaps she briefly escaped from whoever picked her up and ran, unknowingly heading south, trying to find help. But there's a good chance she'd have known she was closer to town than her parents' home at that point. We don't have a clear idea of why she ran into the woods as soon as truck driver Jeff turned around. Perhaps she was afraid of stranger danger. Or maybe she knew the bad guy she'd escaped from was looking for her and feared that the truck that was turning around was coming back for her. The storage shed could have been a hiding place. So you see, with so many questions and very few answers, we can only grasp at straws and guess what might have happened to Asia. While more clues come to light, that seemed to take this story toward an even darker turn. Asia got into someone's car, willingly or unwillingly. It wasn't far from where the truck driver spotted her. The car was either a dark green 1970s model, a Lincoln Continental Mark IV, or a Ford Thunderbird. It had rust around the wheel wells. Once police found the buried backpack, it became improbable that Asia was somewhere safe. Then, once police got the tip about the green car, it seemed a certainty that someone had abducted this child. It is possible that the pickup was opportunistic rather than planned. A violent pedophile, a sex offender, or some other kind of criminal saw a little girl walking alone on the side of the highway and managed to get her into the car. Truckers who saw her on the side of the road were radioing back and forth. Perhaps someone was listening to the CB conversation and decided to go and take her. No responsible adult would just pick up a child her age and run off with her. Someone who meant well for her would have found the nearest phone to call the police, the number on the backpack, or 911. None of these things happened. The theory of opportunism doesn't help to explain why she left the house, or why the dogs couldn't follow her scent. It doesn't shed light on where Asia thought she was going. But it does explain why she was so hard to find later. Do you think she ran afoul of the wrong person at the wrong time? Given Asia's apparent plan to leave, there was a chance she could have been groomed, and that someone planned to pick her up that night, either at a prearranged meeting location or near Asia's house. Based on what she packed, it seemed to indicate that she was going somewhere fun and that she'd need her basketball uniform. While she did not have access to the internet, plenty of adults were in her orbit at home, school, and at church. Someone who knew her could have easily spun a lie that a 9-year-old would believe in the hopes of luring Asia out of the house that night. When questioned later, some of Asia's friends revealed that a few days before her disappearance, on February 10, 2000, Asia showed them some money she was carrying in her wallet. Nobody, including her parents, knew where that money could have come from. This could be another indication that an adult was leading her into danger. Law enforcement officials have investigated many suspects over the years, though none of them have ever panned out. For example, they briefly thought they had a solid suspect in Donald Preston Ferguson in South Carolina. Ferguson, aged 52, was initially arrested for first-degree murder and sex offenses after the death of 7-year-old Shalonda Poole. Shalonda was found dead behind a Greensboro elementary school, but nothing tied Ferguson to the Asha Degree case. There may have been some more obvious suspects closer to Asia. As mentioned, she was a cautious child. Some sources indicate she was afraid of the dark, thunderstorms, and strangers, and that she didn't like opening the door for people without getting permission from her mother. If she did get into someone's car voluntarily, it may well have been someone she trusted implicitly. Law enforcement officials have been tight-lipped about possible suspects to avoid jeopardizing the investigation. Other people involved can't say who has been ruled out, who remains under suspicion, or why certain suspects might still be on the roster. In an effort to tell this story responsibly, I won't start speculating on who might have taken her. I do want to reiterate that every member of her immediate family has already been ruled out as a suspect after extensive investigation. Do you believe that someone who knew Asia betrayed her young, innocent trust? The FBI, the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigations, the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children are still actively looking for Asha Degree more than 20 years later. Law enforcement believes there is plenty of work left to be done on this case, and that plenty of leads could continue to develop. However, everyone involved emphasizes that the public will play an essential role in helping them solve this case. Even small pieces of information can help. To that end, the FBI released age-progressed photos and sent them to the public. They continue to gather tips and track leads. Law enforcement said they collected new evidence in 2022, though they have not released the details of that evidence thus far. They began urging the culprit to come forward and clear their conscience before police found them. Perhaps the answers are closer than ever. IKEA, Harold, and O'Brien have never given up hope. All these years, They have remained in the same home and kept their landline phone number just in case Asia walks through the front door or tries to call. Every year, they host a walk from their home along Highway 18, taking Asia's apparent route to the spot where she was last seen. A billboard stands there now displaying her photo, a phone number, and a $45,000 reward for her safe return. O'Brien has a daughter of his own now, one who is the spitting image of Asia as a child, and also one who shares her name. The family is obviously still hurting, still hoping. IKEA says she won't believe her daughter is dead, until someone can prove it to her with 99.9% certainty. Clearly, law enforcement has never found a body. Asia was last seen wearing a white nightshirt with a teddy bear on it. She had on acid-wash jeans and Nike basketball shoes, size 3. Asia would be 33 years old today. If she's alive, she'll have a chickenpox scar on the center of her forehead and pierced ears. If you see her, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children advises you not to approach her. Instead, call your local emergency number. If you have any credible information that could help solve this case, please contact the FBI at a special page on their website, just for Asia. I'll include the link in the story notes. If you have insights, theories, or thoughts about this case, feel free to share your comment. Thank you for joining us at Odd Mysteries Stories. My name is Vince. I invite you to hear about another story. The Feeney family murders is a tragic and mysterious case. Learn about the heartbreaking events, the investigation that followed, and the unanswered questions that still linger.